Hello, everyone, and welcome to North Atlantic Books webinar with Benebell Wen, Triggering Creativity, Using Tarot for Creative and Artistic Projects. I'm Kim Westerman, Digital Marketing Manager at North Atlantic Books, and I'm excited to have Benebell with us today. Benebell Wen is a lawyer, fashion designer, and literary journal editor. She has studied tarot for over 15 years and is a certified tarot master with the Tarot Certification Board of America. She is also a feng shui consultant, I Ching practitioner, numerologist, and astrology enthusiast. I'm very happy to have her here today, and I'd like to hand the mic over to her now.
All right, thank you so much for that amazing introduction, Kim. It makes me sound a lot cooler than I actually am. All right, thank you everyone for joining me on a Saturday. That actually means a lot to me. Today we're going to be talking about how to trigger creativity using tarot cards. And I do presume that there's going to be people in the audience that don't know a lot about tarot. So for those who are seasoned tarot practitioners, please bear with me for a little bit. There may be a little bit of reinventing the wheel here. We're going to start with a couple of definitions just to give us some context, like what is intuitive creativity. And then we're going to talk about how you can attune to the tarot cards and really begin using them to apply to artistic projects. And then I'm going to go through the substance of this webinar, which is tarot spreads and techniques that you can begin using right away. So what is intuitive creativity? Well, it's a term coined by Dr. Joan Rees, and I took this from her dissertation. And intuitive creativity is essentially, it's actually a part of our minds that's connected perhaps to a greater intelligence that has high capacity for decision making. And this is very innovative decision making that we may not have access to on the conscious level. So what am I talking about when I'm talking about these terms? So consciousness, at least as I'm going to be talking about it, it's sensations, it's the perceptions, feelings, it's awareness. Consciousness is awareness. Then we have the subconscious, which is the repository of memories, emotions, and impulses that have become disconnected from our consciousness. So it's basically a database of everything that we have sensed throughout our lives and beyond that, but that have disconnected from our awareness sort of as a defense mechanism and for survival. As a result, there's also going to be repressed memories, traumatic experiences, emotions, things like that that are in the subconscious. The unconscious is the automatic process that's governed by our minds. And Carl Jung has subdivided the unconscious into the personal versus the collective unconscious. What I'm really interested in today is the collective unconscious. That's, as Adolf Bastian, a cultural anthropologist, has said, the psychic unity of mankind. Carl Jung calls it the whole spiritual heritage of mankind's evolution. It's born anew in the brain structure of every single individual. Now, intuitive creativity, as I said, is a part of our mind. I believe it rests somewhere between the subconscious and the unconscious. It has one foot perhaps in the subconscious level of our minds. Most of it, though, is going to be in the unconscious with deep roots in that collective unconscious, that psychic unity of mankind, that part of our minds that are connected to the minds of everybody else in our species. Other terms that we've been using to describe intuitive creativity in the past, it's basically just invoking the muses. It's that aha moment. It's divine inspiration. So what triggers it? How do we trigger intuitive creativity? Well, it's essentially just looking at something through a different angle, a new perspective. It's triggered by signs and symbols, a language that the tarot speaks. I'll talk about that a little bit later, and seeing omens. And these are what I describe as the transcendent experience. What is the transcendent experience? Well, it's basically just the catalyst. The transcendent experience is the catalyst that triggers intuitive creativity. It's what brings creativity, intuitive creativity, to the surface of our consciousness. It makes us aware of it so that we can begin using it productively. It can retrieve lost, suppressed, or forgotten ideas in the personal unconscious, or it can retrieve archetypal experiences inherited from the species, and that's part of the collective unconscious. I have an example for what the transcendent experience is. It's a very simple example, and it's kind of goofy. So I don't know if you've seen the movie Honey. We don't have to debate the merits of the movie, but it's actually really good for explaining the transcendent experience. In the movie, it features Jessica Alba. She plays a hip hop dance choreographer. Okay, I don't remember the premise, but basically, for the purposes of this hypothetical, okay, she has to choreograph this really innovative dance for, I don't know if it was a battle or a music video, but she has to choreograph it. An innovative dance, and she hits a creative block. She can't think of dance moves that is going to really bring her team to the next level or something like that. So she goes out to the streets searching for inspiration. She happens to observe a pickup game, and while she watches the basketball players playing basketball, she sees their movements, and it's a synchronistic event where she gets to see her dance situation, her dance project, through a different perspective, a different angle, which is the basketball players. And that also serves as a sign and symbol. And the more woo-woo aspect of that is the synchronicity of the event. Seeing the basketball players at the exact moment when she needs to trigger her own creative, intuitive creativity, and using that experience to then create a very revolutionary and a very innovative dance, and of course, happily ever after, win. Perhaps a better example, one that's actually more associated with the concept of the transcendent experience, would be Albert Einstein. Now, Albert Einstein himself was a violinist, and he very much accredited classical music to many of his discoveries. So, for example, he credits Mozart's musical compositions for his theory of relativity. When Einstein is doing his best thinking, he likes to enter a trance-like state. And in that trance-like state, he listens to Mozart. And when he's listening to Mozart, it's not just about enjoying the music, but he's listening to the internal architecture of the melodies. And when he listens to the internal architecture of the melodies and the harmonies, he applies that as basically a different perspective, as signs and symbols, to whatever it is, the mathematical or the scientific innovation that he's working on. And he attributes the theory of relativity to listening to Mozart. And I have the source down there. It was Miller. And a lot of scientists over the years have actually talked about the theory of relativity as having this incredibly beautiful and harmonic internal structure. And so in many ways, it does resonate with the way Mozart has composed his music, if you're familiar with the compositions. So what I'm proposing here is, instead of going out, wandering around, and I mean, listening to Mozart is fantastic, but tarot is an incredible tool that you can have on hand for triggering transcendent experiences. And instead of having to wait for that aha moment, it can almost be on call in a sense, because you can use the tarot to retrieve information from that part of your mind that has the repository of intuitive creativity. Now, what is tarot exactly? Well, tarot is a set of 78 cards. It's subdivided into the major arcana and the minor arcana. So when I'm talking about the major arcana here, key 0, which is the Fool, or here the Spirit, that's the hero in our hero's journey, or when we're talking about in tarot terms, the Fool and the Fool's journey. Then we have the other cards, the 21 cards of the major arcana, subdivided into the 3 septenaries. Keys 1 through 7 we often see as representative of the self, or the ego. Now, in creative terms, if we see the major arcana, the 3 septenaries, as the 3 subdivisions of a narrative arc, keys 1 through 7 then become the exposition. That's introducing the characters. So keys 1 and 2, for example, would be the magician and the high priestess. That's the yang and the yin of the ego. And I had a PDF download. It's a handout that comes along with this webinar. It has all of this information in there. So if you're taking notes, don't worry if you're not, if I'm going too fast. It's all in the webinar. I mean, it's all in the handout that comes with this. Then you have keys 3 and 4, for example, that's the mother and father figure. You have authority figures. Key 6, the lovers. I see that as primordial errors that sends our hero on his journey. So that's what keys 1 through 7 represent, is the exposition, introduction of the characters. Keys 8 through 14, the collective. Now we're talking about rising action, inciting incidences. So for example, key 8, strength, would be the test of personal fortitude for our hero. And key 9, for example, is seeking the counsel of a wise man. Key 10, wheel of fortune, would be our turning point. Then the final septenary, the divine union, that's the climax, that's the denouement. So we have key 15, the devil, that's when we face our demons. Key 16, the tower, is often seen as the climax, the star, the moon, etc. Now we have the falling action. Now in the minor arcana, we have 4 suits, and these represent the facets of the human condition. The batons, or the suit of wands, we have, I always see that as being force, passion, aspirations, and creativity, and it also represents the working class, the proletariat. And it is the energy of synergy that is really going to be important when we see how it applies to creativity. Chalices, or the cups, that's intuition, that's the emotional plane, empathy, and it's also relationships, characters. That's the clergyman in terms of the traditional attributions. The swords is truth, intellect, knowledge, communication, dialogue, ideas, and that corresponds with the nobility. And the coins, pentacles, that's our material resources. That's how we use our resources, pragmatism, diligence, and that corresponds with the artisans and merchants. Now, how do you treat tarot as a synchronistic event for the transcendent experience? Well, the tarot is a symbolic language. The entire webinar here is predicated on the theory that a language made up of signs and symbol that represent particular archetypes is the bridge between our consciousness, our conscious mind, what we're aware of, and the personal unconscious, and also beyond that, the collective unconscious. The tarot expresses a narrative. When you look at the imagery on the tarot cards, and here I'm referring specifically to the Rider-Waite-Smith tradition of tarot, each card tells a story. Under the theory of synchronicity, that narrative in the cards is your narrative, and it is told back to you through the cards to trigger the transcendent experience. Tarot itself, it expresses Joseph Campbell's idea of the monomyth, which is the theory that all the world's mythic narratives are just variations of a single greater story. Tarot also helps reveal the structure of what we're doing. It's grounded on the hypothesis that there is a higher intelligence within us, in our unconscious, that knows exactly where we are. So it's like a map. Within all of our unconscious, we have a map of where we've been, where we're going, where we're headed. It's this entire map of our lives, a web of sorts, and it knows exactly where we are. The conscious parts of our minds, what we're aware of, is just that one section of where we are. So we can't see the greater picture. Tarot allows us to see basically the greater picture and gives us context. And it provides a different perspective. So instead of talking about your situation with the same words and same expressions you've been bogged down by, and that's what has caused your creative block, you are now talking about your situation through, for example, the Ace of Pentacles, the Seven of Swords, the Ace of Cups, the Death card, the Six of Wands. And when you do that, you're triggering the transcendent experience and bringing about your own aha moment in creativity. There's also the concept of as above, so below. I do talk about this a little bit more in my book, Holistic Tarot, in one of the footnotes, but in very, very simple terms here for the purposes of this webinar, it basically means, it basically expresses the interconnectivity that the theory of tarot is founded on. So let's use an example here. Key 0, the Fool. The symbolic language here. When you look at the card, look at the symbols, and deconstruct it into the symbols, you see immediately the white sun, the white rose, the white dog, the red feather, the beggar's knapsack over his shoulder, the mountains, for example, and most notably, the fact that the figure is at the edge of a cliff and not looking at where he's going. So these are the signs and symbols that your unconscious is using to communicate with your consciousness. When you're able to understand and interpret these signs and symbols, that's how you're retrieving information from your unconscious. That's the transcendent experience. The interpretation is the transcendent experience that brings information in your unconscious up to the surface of the consciousness so that you can use it productively. When we see the Fool card, when it appears, we see it as the harbinger of new beginnings. It means a life path of unbound potential. Usually it's about, it shows that we're at a critical point for decision making. We're about to face a critical decision. When the Fool card appears, you start thinking about the journey that the hero is about to take and the unbound potential and how that's going to manifest. The Fool card itself is a form of archetype. It's the trickster archetype, or that's how I like to see it. And you see this archetype, the Fool. You see the Fool throughout many stories around the world. I give a couple examples. Loki, Sun Wukong in Chinese mythology, Sinbad the Sailor in Persian, Puck, for example. Now you can see how the Fool has manifested in story and how when you get the Fool card in a reading, how it might manifest in your own stories. Now, this part is always interesting to me, which is why I included it in the webinar. These are figures that we know and love who have used tarot for creative intuition or intuitive creativity. W.B. Yeats, for example. Yeats was actually believed to have contributed directly to the symbology on the Rider-Waite-Smith tarot deck, which is the tarot deck you see illustrated throughout this entire webinar. And he assisted A.E. Waite, the creator of the deck, and Pamela Coleman Smith, who is the artist who illustrated the tarot deck. Yeats was a member of the Golden Dawn, and if you've ever come across his poem, The Tower, well, that's a reference specifically to Key 16, the Tower from the Major Arcana. Franz Kafka, who was also a fellow lawyer, famous writer, of course, scholars speculate that Kafka was affiliated with the Freemasons and that throughout his works, he has littered tons of Masonic symbolism, and he utilized tarot symbolism directly in his prose. June Levitt actually is the scholar who came across that information and has some fantastic books about that. T.S. Eliot, well, Eliot's The Wasteland references very specific cards from the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. And Eliot was also a faithful admirer of P.D. Ouspensky, who the tarot enthusiasts among us will probably know. Ouspensky was an occultist and author of the seminal work, The Symbolism of the Tarot. Jean Sibelius, one of my favorite musical composers, well, he was a disciple of Madame Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society, and he's definitely been connected with tarot practice. Also, he wrote the 1911 musical, The Language of the Birds, and the language of the birds, the language of the birds itself are code words, which indicate an esoteric language of signs and symbols revealing divine secrets. That essentially is the definition of tarot. Vasily Kandinsky, a painter, well, he was another prominent creative mind associated with Theosophy. The thought forms at the foundations of his paintings are believed to be inspired by occult roots. And, he's definitely attributed to the modern abstract art movement and what he refers to as the epoch of the great spiritual. Kandinsky also left behind a vast occult library, which included multiple books on tarot divination. Now, more contemporary examples, we have the poet laureate and Pulitzer Prize winner Kay Ryan, one of my favorite poets. And Kay Ryan has openly attributed her creative writing to tarot, and she uses tarot in creative writing exercises. She's talked about how she draws tarot cards and uses them as writing prompts. Cormac McCarthy, in his book, The Blood Meridian, tarot cards are used to represent the subconscious of the characters. Now, literary critics such as John Sepik have believed that the character Judge Holden in Blood Meridian expresses Key 0, the Fool. The judge's role in the narrative is likened to the role of the Fool in the Major Arcana, and that's worked on by Emily J. Stinson in Southwestern American literature. John Sepik, who wrote notes on Blood Meridian, says that the Four of Cups, in fact, is the key to understanding McCarthy's Blood Meridian. And there are other tarot cards referenced throughout the book: Four of Wands, the Chariot, Wheel of Fortune, the High Priestess. One of my favorites, Italo Calvino. While the narrative in Italo Calvino's The Castle of Crossed Destinies is told through the cards of the tarot deck. Then finally, we have Modi Zimmelman, who is a dance choreographer, and he's created compositions that were inspired by tarot imagery. Now, how do you use tarot? How do you connect to the signs and symbols in a way that's going to be meaningful to you? I talk about it in two separate ways. There's one way which I refer to as traditional attunement, and the second way which is called personal attunement. Now, first I'll talk about traditional attunement. Traditional attunement is predicated on the belief that there's this collective unconscious that is the psychic unity of mankind. And over many, many years and frequent use by powerful minds in our history, keying certain cards to certain meanings, those cards have achieved or inherited very set meanings based on this collective unconscious. That's traditional attunement. Now, in very more basic terms, just pick up a book. Get a book on tarot and learn the card meanings. And that's basically my conception of the traditional attunement. Again, this is based also on the idea of as above, so below. You get the sense where the elements and numerology and astrology do have something to do with the meaning of the cards. As an example, we have the Eight of Pentacles. Now, the elemental dignities associated with the cards, or at least I associate with the cards, would be for the dignity, earth, because earth is related to the suit of pentacles for me, and the affinity, water, for the number 8. So you're going to see earth is material manifestation. So that's what we're going to be really talking about when we see this card. And water, there's that emotional element that's coming in as a subtone. There's something emotional or spiritually important about this task at hand. Then you have the number 8, which represents materialism, diligence, aspirations, fortuity. And for those who are familiar with the meaning of this card, you can see how this is all coming together. Astrologically, let's say it's the sun in Virgo. Well, the sun in Virgo we think of as being meticulous energy, being detail oriented, and a very strong dedication to a personal project. So these meanings come together. And if you prefer using a form of traditional attunement where you are accessing the collective unconscious, then I hope you'll pick up a book such as Holistic Tarot to help you with learning and acclimating with the card meanings. But you don't need a book. You really just don't. Another way of reading tarot is what I refer to as personal attunement, but tarot practitioners often refer to as intuitive reading. Now, intuitive reading, there's no book involved. You pick up the card and you look at the card yourself. This is where you derive meanings based on your own subconscious and your personal unconscious. Now, how would you do that? So let's say you pick up the Eight of Pentacles. Now, instead of going at it through traditional attunement, we're going at it now through personal attunement. Where do you start? Look at the symbols and see where your eyes focus on. Now, for example, I focus on the hammer that the figure is carrying. What does the hammer symbolize to you? I've given a couple of bullet points on the slide for what I came up with when I was brainstorming. Well, when I see the hammer, I think of industry, shop trades. Reminds me of a creator. Then you look at the canvas in front of the artisan. What does that represent? To me, that's detail-oriented work. That's somebody who's incredibly diligent. And then you have the pentacles that are lined up against the side of the card. For me, that's showing great pride in his work. There's passion involved here. The red pants he wears shows somebody who aspires to improve their social status. Coin on the ground is sort of discarded to the side. Perfectionism, somebody who demands perfection in his or her own work. Now, the home you see right in the background, what does the town and the pathway symbolize to you? Think about that and use that to attune to the meaning of the cards. So in a sense, you're programming the cards personally so that whenever you pick up this card, your subconscious or your personal unconscious knows exactly what to associate with this card. And that's how you go about personal attunement. Now, how do you actually use it? So I like to go with the one card draw. It's the easiest to work with. You have a tarot deck, you shuffle the deck, you think about what it is that you need to think about, and you pick a card. You think about that card, you write about it, you jot down notes, and that's how you really begin to trigger creativity. So let's say you shuffle the deck and you pick up the Knight of Cups. That's what we're using here. So many ways you can use this. For example, card of the day. In the morning, before you sit down to work on your project, you can just shuffle the deck, draw a card, and ask, what do you need to accomplish that day for your project? You pick the card, and then you think about it, whether you're using traditional attunement or personal attunement. Using your methodology, you identify for yourself what that card means to you so that you can set your goals for the day. I also like to use it for story divination. So I'll talk about this a little bit more later on in this presentation as well. But very quickly, story divination is if you feel really stuck, you don't know what's going to happen next in the narrative arc of what you're working on. And this is not just, in writing, in any form of creative work. You don't know what's going to happen next. Pick a card, look at the signs and symbols of that card, and figure out if anything there can trigger you to move forward. Also helps with progress update. What do you most need to know right now about how to advance in your current project? Pick a card, do a divination on that. Now, for choreographers and dancers, I heard a dancer once talk about how because of how the body movements are in that. So use the body as inspiration. When you draw a card, look at the figure's facial expression, the posture and movements, and see what story is told through the body and how that can be applied to your work. You can also just focus on symbols. Again, this is the personal attunement part. And when I'm talking about traditional versus personal, it's not mutually exclusive. In fact, most tarot readers do not just subscribe to one method. They're going to be working on a hybrid method. So that's exactly what you will be doing too, once you become more acclimated with the tarot. This is another method I really like to use. First, you start with a signifier or a significator. I have a whole chapter in my book on signifiers, which is traditionally referred to as the significator card. For the purposes of the person who's just using tarot for creativity, it can be that one card that you just drew. For example, the Knight of Cups that we just drew, okay? So watch the animation carefully to see how the cards are dealt out. And again, this is in the handout, the downloadable handout that comes with this. Now, this is based on a much larger, more comprehensive technique that's found in esoteric tarot practice, but we're not going to really be talking about that. We're taking that, adapting it to what we need here to identify our creative focus when using tarot for our projects. So now you have 4 piles. What you would do is go through the 4 piles to search for that signifier card. Let's say that was the Knight of Cups. Now let's say the Knight of Cups appears in the first pile for fire. That's the physical plane. Again, we're predicating this on the subdivision of our projects and the subdivision of human existence on 4 planes: physical, emotional, mental, and material planes. So when your signifier card appears in the fire plane, we're talking about the fire, we're talking about the physical plane. We're going to be focusing on structural issues and the physical form, creation, passions, and also the means of validation that's going to be most critical to our project. Okay, now let's say instead appears in the emotional plane. Now we're going to want to focus on relationships, characters, and emotion, the empathy and the sensitivity. You're going to want to think about the artistry of your project. If it appears in the air pile for the mental plane, address the conflicts. This is also about communication because it does relate to air, and traditionally we associate air with communications, dialogue, the dialectic. So here we're talking about critique and analysis. I found that whenever the card appears here, there's editing and revision work to be done. Look at the dialogue, look at the means of communications, things like that. And also there's going to be a need for objectivity. Think of things objectively in the rational plane, not the emotional or otherwise. When it appears in the last pile for Earth, now we have practical or financial considerations. You're looking at setting, venue, and maybe even stylistic issues, business, commerce. So another technique I'm going to show is the simple cross spread. This is based very, very loosely on the Worth cross, which was conceived by Oswald Worth. I think it was in the Tarot of the Bohemians. I forgot to put it down in my notes. I'm really sorry. But circa 1927, give or take. However, the Worth cross, notably, was meant just for the major arcana. Then later on throughout time, contemporary uses or contemporary adaptations, of course, have expanded it to be applied to the entire deck. And we're now using the entire deck for this. And also, it's very loosely based on the Worth cross, mostly just the structure of it. And this structure I really like for people who are just using tarot only for creative purposes, is because it's just great for mind mapping. When I say mind mapping, I'm talking about a visual diagram of information that's focused around a single issue or concept. And you can use this spread essentially for any question. And I'm going to prove it to you through this webinar. You can use it to talk about your work in progress, to do character analysis, plotting your narrative, and exploring themes. Essentially, what you need to know about this spread. The first card usually is a signifier. It's that card that you pick from the one card draw, or you don't have to. It can just be the first card you pick after the shuffle. This is really about the present. This is how the project manifests currently. The card below it, because it is below it, you can see it's about the roots, the foundation of the project, what's most important about the base. On the left side, I like to see that as the past, and also the current status, though. It's the summation of past influences that still are, that have an effect on the present, that are important and critical to the present trajectory. At the top, this is the speculative position. So this is hopes and fears, but these are also the most critical issues to focus on. It can often represent challenges that need to be overcome, and basically what to think about next in order to reach here, which is the future position. And this is where the project is headed based on its current trajectory. And now this very basic model can be applied to many, many different kinds of inquiries. I'm going to give an example. Let's say we have Fred the filmmaker. Now, Fred the filmmaker, he has a partial draft of his script. He hasn't figured out the ending yet, and he's thinking about entering his project into a competition. So he's been experiencing writer's block as of late. He doesn't know how to move forward, and he's lacking the motivation. Now, here, let's say he uses the simple cross spread to get a sense, to mind map where he is at right now. Now, those who understand the meanings, and when I get into it, you'll see that a lot of it is just validation. You feel like it's not new information at the surface. So, for example, the first card that comes up is the Empress. Empress, creativity, fertility, of course, those are the traditional meanings. But here, as applied to Fred, his project is in a gestation period. It's been conceived, hasn't been given birth yet. It's a gestation period. And he knows that. We know that. This is not new information. But then what you can do is, now that you've been validated, okay, that's true, this is the gestation period, study the signs and symbols of the cards. For example, the stars in her hair, or right now I'm being pulled to the Venus astrological glyph that's on the shield. So Venus, okay, what's Venus? That's beauty and harmony. So you're thinking, okay, what elements of beauty and harmony need to be added to what he has so far to further develop it? That's what we're talking about when we say triggering creativity. Look at the card, the surface meaning, it validates you, it grounds you. Then you go deeper by looking at the symbols and understanding what those symbols mean. The signs and symbols are the language that your unconscious is using to speak to your conscious, to try to bring more information to the surface. Now in the back, again, same thing. He already told us that he's thinking about entering into a competition, and we see the Five of Wands, which very much, you don't really need to read tarot to know that that symbolizes competition. And at the root of all this, we see that very critical decisions need to be made. So he's going to be thinking about the direction that his story is going to go in, and he's going to use the Justice card to trigger some more insights into that. Now, the Eight of Wands at the top really tells us where he has to go. He really needs to find the motivation very quickly, and it has to be a race to the finish line. He is going to have to accelerate the level of his work at this point. You have Inner Fortitude, the Strength card, which is where he's headed. Now, what's interesting about this card is the fire energy that corresponds with strength, for me, represents spring, and also the fact that all the other cards in here, you have the dominance of the wands, which also correspond with fire. That really anchors in my mind spring for timing, and so that's going to be critical for Fred as well when he's thinking about his project. And again, we had talked earlier about what the major arcana cards symbolize in the various septenaries, and you're going to bring that in to your understanding of the strength card, and that's going to help him understand where he's going with his project. Now, a more comprehensive technique when he's reading about a work in progress. I already showed how you could apply the worth cross, and you don't need to do this whole comprehensive technique. You can just use the worth cross. But to read about a work in progress, you can just draw a single card and look at that card. That card can also become the signifier for identifying your creative focus. So let's say Fred had cut the cards into 4 piles and to try to identify where he needs to focus on right now. And the first card that he drew had been the Empress. Or first, for example, let's say he did the Worth cross. Then he takes the center card, the Empress, shuffles the deck, then does the creative focus. You do whatever feels right for you in terms of trying to access information. Either way, The Empress card, let's say, appears in the mental plane. Now we're saying he needs to look closely at the dialogue, which is interesting because he's writing a script. But the air pile is about communications, and so we're looking at the dialogue of his project. We're also thinking about revisionary work when we see the signifier card appearing in the air pile. Another example, Nina the novelist. So now Nina is working on her debut novel. Now, I've taken all of these case studies, and there's plenty of case studies in Holistic Tarot, which are going to be able to go expand more in depth into how to read tarot specifically. I'm going very, very quickly here with the interpretations in the interest of time, so bear with me here. Nina the novelist, she is a writer, and she's currently experiencing writer's block, and she's pretty sure it's because she doesn't understand one of the main characters in her novel. And let's say that character is Grayson. So who is this character, Grayson? This is a fictional character in her debut novel, okay? Grayson is from a small suburban town in upstate New York. He's in his 30s, and he teaches at the local community college. Now, Grayson is having an affair with one of his students. So this is all what Nina knows so far, but she doesn't understand beyond that, and she's trying to figure out where she's going to go with this novel and what Grayson is all about. She can use the tarot to do a character analysis of Grayson. We're using the same exact techniques, but just changing up the meanings and positions a little bit. For example, okay, again, the one card draw, you draw a single card, and you look at that card to think about, and thinking about the character, you pick a card. Let's say we get the Seven of Pentacles. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Right away, though, I see somebody who has always been a very hardworking, financially responsible person, very prudent, safe, a workaholic, family man perhaps, but if you look at that expression, there's hesitation. Perhaps there's a dissatisfaction now with, this vanilla life, or, not really wanting to pick at those fruits, or trying to, second guess it. Now let's say we use the identifying the creative focus technique, and the signifier card that we pick, it appears in the second pile for the emotional plane. Well, that makes perfect sense. And again, actually, this is based on a real reading done. But I've changed around, the names and characters for anonymity purposes. But you'll see the synchronicities very frequently when you become a practitioner of tarot. I can't explain it. These kinds of synchronicities happen all of the time. So Grayson's signifier appears in the emotional plane. That means we're going to have to focus on his emotional maturity, and also home, heart, family, and his relationships with other people, which is pretty much what Nina's book was going to be all about. Now you see again the simple cross, but if you notice the captions, they've changed a little bit. So they've changed from how you would read the work in progress, but they're all based on the foundational, fundamental meanings that we first saw when I was introducing the simple cross. The first card is, okay, how the character is perceived. This is the general picture that we get when we see the character. Underneath it, we have the underlying motivations of our character. The left, we have the past influences on the character's motivations, above the character's thoughts, and to the right, where the character is headed. So let's say Nina does a very simple cross spread for this. So right away, you can see you have the Seven of Pentacles, which shows exactly where Grayson is right now, reevaluating where he is up to this present moment, and thinking about the vanilla life he's led, how boring it is, and how he can bring some excitement into his life, which is probably what triggered, got him rolling into the affair with the student in the first place. Now, the underlying motivation here you see in the Hermit card, we get the sense, no, this is actually a pretty good faith sense in him. He does have a very sincere desire to mentor the bright and the young. So you get that sense. A Page of Pentacles at the top, by the way, very traditionally, Page of Pentacles, you are going to see a scholarly young woman, and so here we've interpreted that as, him thinking about that student, and that's going to be expressive of the student that he ends up having an affair with. Now, we had talked about the Fool card before, and now here in the position at the left, he's pretty oblivious to the consequences of his actions going forward, and also we're going to be talking about the chronology of the hero's journey, and you see that right away in the three cards that run horizontal across the simple cross. And then at the end, though, this is interesting, we have the Queen of Cups, and to Nina, this symbolizes that he is ultimately going to choose his wife, and in the end he's going to try to salvage his marriage with his wife. And also cups represents water, and the signifier, the Son of Pentacles, if you remember, appeared in the water pile during the technique for identifying the creative focus. These little synchronicities validate in Nina's mind that, okay, this is probably going to be the right direction for her novel. And again, you use your judgment call. Does it feel right? If it feels right, then you dig deeper into these specific symbols. For example, the chalice that she carries, what her feet represent in the water, etc., the throne, and use that to then develop the details. You can also use tarot to plot the narrative. Now, this is a very basic process. So what I like to do is you shuffle the cards, you pick up one card. This is that one card draw, unless it was the Queen of Swords, and you study that card, and then you think about it, whether it's through traditional or personal attunement. Take your notes, write it down in your journal, and understand that card. Then what I do is I take the pile of cards that had been in front of the signifier, move it to the back. So the top card is the signifier card. I set it down, and you just go through the deck face up one by one, and in each card you stop at that card and you study the symbolism and see if it can trigger inspiration for your narrative. So if you're trying to figure out the plot points for your narrative, pick a card. That's your plot point. Think about it. How can you apply what you see in that card to the plot points? What happens next? Pick another card, and you can use this to try to help yourself outline a project. Once you've used this exercise to outline your project, then you can, this is using the intuitive part, then you can look in objectively and critically and see what makes sense and what doesn't, and in that way you're really mind mapping and brainstorming for your project, and using this to really mine a deeper part of your brain to get information and creativity that's already within you. You can also use tarot to explore themes. So my final hypothetical is going to be Paul. Paul is a poet. He's working on his second collection of poetry. Now, he already has a few poems that he knows will be in the collection. At this stage, he wants to consult the tarot to get a sense of the themes and what themes to explore, because he hasn't figured out how to unify the various poems into a cohesive collection yet. He has a couple, he has more to write. How is he going to unify all of this under some cohesive themes? Additionally, he'd like inspiration for the poems that he hasn't written yet. What else can he write about? All of this he can do through the tarot. So he does a tarot reading. Again, you can use the one card draw. One card draws are very good for trying to explore themes. You can also use the technique that I talked about for identifying the creative focus. So when I see the Ace of Swords, this is the beginnings, the birth of conquest of some sort. I also associate it with the Philosopher King. Now let's say the Ace of Swords appears in the very first pile. What does that mean for him? Well, he's talking about the body, the physical plane. And we can probably be thinking on passions and also about health issues, perhaps, wellness issues. These may play in some way. We don't know yet. Then he can take the deck and take the first card, the Ace of Swords, set it down for the first one. And again, if you look at the captions, they change a little bit now for an application to exploring themes. And those captions and the entire diagrams for these different methodologies are explained in detail in the accompanying handout. So let's say he does the spread. Now the first card we see is I see that as expressive of the journey of the Philosopher King, and it's in the beginnings. So that's really where he's going to begin steering the collection. Now, a recurring motif in his collection is probably going to be aspirations to transcend the father figure. I get that when I see the Two of Wands. And so what Paul is going to want to do is to think very critically on what the Two of Wands means to him, use either the traditional or personal attunement methodology that he subscribes by, and also have this map, this layout, this mind map, these 5 cards out somewhere near his workbench or where he does his writing, so that he can constantly refer back to these 5 cards and utilize the symbols to keep him on track and to keep him, focused on the cohesive themes that will bring his collection of poetry together. Here, underlying motifs, you really do see something about the father figure, or in some way, whatever the Two of Wands means to Paul, that's going to be the recurring motif. He's going to be really thinking about how the meaning of this card anchors his collection of poetry. Now, in the past position, you have the Five of Swords. Here it's about defeating others to get ahead. It's exercises of the ego. There's something Machiavellian about the energy of this card. So Paul is going to want to think about parts of his own personal life that represent these aspects that he can bring into his poetry. Was there something that he's not proud of, the darker shadow side of him that he wants to explore as themes in his poetry? So Machiavellian exercises is what's going to be interesting. Exercises of his ego and how that's taken place in his life and how he can write poetry about that. At the top, the speculative position. Well, this is going to be how can you describe his collection of poetry? Well, it's aggression with race. That's what I see when I see the Page of Swords. And again, he's going to retrieve the information from his unconscious through either the traditional attunement methodology or the personal attunement. And finally, where he's headed, what to write about going forward. Well, he can write about moral choices. When I see the Lovers card, this is the primordial errors card, and I see this as really representing a choice between the tree of life, which is transcendence, the ascension toward the divine, and to get there, it's through forbearance, or through the tree of knowledge, which is enjoying the physical pleasures, and it's also to know suffering. So the tree of life versus the tree of knowledge, and how that might play out in more concrete terms, will be how Paul can explore future poems, and that's going to, bring together the Two of Wands card, and also he's going to think back on what the Five of Swords means to him, which interestingly enough, when you're talking about exercises of the ego, does relate pretty closely to what we're talking about here in the Lovers card. So I hope, if nothing else, that my presentation has inspired you to learn tarot for yourself. And if you do learn tarot for yourself, I hope you pick up my book, Holistic Tarot, to do so. If you want to really get into it, I do have free study guides at either the beginner, the intermediate, and the advanced levels that you can download from my website, benebellwen.com, and you can use that to begin learning how to use tarot. This focus more on triggering creativity. My book is more on the holistic practice of tarot. I want to end this webinar, this presentation, on a final, very important note. I really encourage you to get a professional reading. Professional tarot readers are very, very much like artists and writers in the sense that they're fantastic at observing people. And the whole profession, what they do for a living is observe people and pick up on patterns and commonalities and see the narrative arcs of other people and how those narrative arcs apply to you. So they have this vast pool of experience that you may not necessarily have, and you can really benefit from their experiences with human observation. What is a tarot practitioner? Well, they specialize in tapping into the collective unconscious. That's what they do for a living. And so you can really find these experts and have them help you with your creative projects. And they're also a lot more experienced with the language of tarot. So yes, of course, you can read tarot for yourself, and there's the different methodologies, but a lot of times what you can glean is at one level, and then the professional tarot reader can just take it to that next level. They can pick up on nuances and patternicities that you just didn't pick up on, and that's going to really help you not only with the project at hand, but it's going to help you learn tarot for yourself. So it's really important at some point, if you're really serious about this, to get a professional reading. They're also more objective. A lot of times when you're reading for yourself, there is that conflict of interest. There's that subjectivity that you don't know how to get over, and your insecurity with that subjectivity. But when you have an objective third party who's a professional, then that's eliminated. And so you are more likely to absorb the messages of the cards. Now, what I would recommend is when you get the professional reading, ask for a write-up or a recording or a photograph of your reading, and that you should keep near your workspace while you do your creations. That's going to really help you anchor the creative trajectory for your project and really help you develop it and advance forward. And that concludes my presentation. I hope my timing was okay and I was within the time, and I think I'm going to bring Kim back now for the Q&A session.
Thank you so much, Benebell. That was just fantastic.
I feel like I
Um,
talked so much.
It was really a wonderful exploration of how to apply tarot to creative endeavors. And we do have a couple of questions already from the audience, but I would like to open the floor to everyone. If you have a question for Benebell, just type it into the question window, into the chat window, and I will pick it up. The first question is, if I'm working with the cards on my own, what is the best way to frame my question?
Um, well, most tarot teachers are going to teach about open-ended questions. You're going to want to start the question with how or what, leave it open so that then when the card appears, you can explore the different meanings to that. Don't ask questions that are too specific in terms of yes or no. Mostly, it's not because it's about whether or not the tarot can answer those questions, yes or no. It's about, is that going to be helpful in getting you to move forward, or are you just asking for a quick fix answer? So if you ask open-ended questions such as how do I move forward with my project, or what do I need to know, then those are the best forms of questions. Or you can use the identifying the creative focus technique to see what it is that you need to focus on. Is it the fire, air, earth, or water plane? And then from there tailor and craft a question.
Okay, thank you. Here's another question about decks other than the Rider Waite. Do you feel that your techniques work with the TDM and other decks as well?
For the Tarot de Marseille, definitely. But if you don't know anything about tarot and you are picking up the Tarot de Marseille and then you pick up the Ten of Swords and the Five of Wands, it's going to be a lot more difficult for you to attune personally to the symbolism of the cards because you're not coming in with a lot of esoteric knowledge, such as the astrological correspondences or the elemental dignities for that card. So you're really just working with what you see on the face of the card. And when you do that, you can scry into the cards. And that's what a lot of people who use tarot for more psychic endeavors are going to do. But if you're using it as an artist, I don't know how productive that is unless you're going to be subscribing to a traditional method of attunement. So Tarot de Marseille can be applied if you have an extensive knowledge with tarot. If you don't necessarily have that background and you're just using the tarot for this particular exercise, I don't know if that's my recommendation. The Thoth deck is, I always say that the Thoth deck is the most powerful of the decks. But to really use it to its full potential, you do need to have a more occult foundation to really get the most out of it. And if you're using it again for creative purposes and your writing tends to be not really geared in that direction, I don't know whether or not the Thoth deck will speak to you. You can try, see if you can find a friend who has the deck, look through the imagery to see if it speaks to you. I don't think my book per se is going to be helpful if you're learning the Thoth system. It does have basic meanings, and a lot of it does cross over to the other systems. But I do think you want to find a book that is keyed to the system that you're working with.
Great. The next question is, would these suggestions that you're making for using the tarot for creative projects be modified at all if we wanted to apply them to more business-oriented problem solving?
Well, I was hoping to do a future presentation or webinar on how to apply it to business. Yeah, I mean, as a corporate attorney, a lot of times the people that I come in touch with who then know about my tarot practice, just because of my arm's length social network, they're going to be entrepreneurs and business people in that area, in the corporate sphere. And so, yeah, of course, you can use any of these spreads for more business-centered questions. If you're very, very fluent with tarot, it's very easy to repackage any of these techniques and use them for business. If you're not that fluent with it, then pick up my book. My book has spreads that teach you exactly how to use it for business purposes.
Great. Here's a question about specifically what's included in your book. This person is saying this was a fantastic presentation, very inspiring. Is this information also included in your book?
Specifically, no. This is actually an adaptation from things that are in the book. So everything you see is in the book, but is keyed more holistically. And in the book, it shows the various ways you can use these techniques and use tarot. Then what I did was I took one facet that was explained in my book, and here in this specific webinar, developed it a lot more fully into an hour presentation that's very, very specific to artists and writers and creative people. In the book, it's more for people of all walks of and all occupations.
It definitely sounds like we're going to have to plan a second webinar, at least one more, perhaps several more.
Okay,
Um,
Kim.
we have time for just a couple more questions. Here's one. What methods do you use to get yourself in the right state for reading these cards?
When I'm reading for myself, I'm a little bit less picky in terms of if I'm feeling calm and grounded. I do meditate pretty frequently, and so because of that practice, it's not terribly difficult for me to get into a specific mindset if I need to on call, unless I'm going through something traumatic, of course, right? I'm not that special. But usually it's pretty, I just ground myself, I center myself. I like it to be quiet. I like to have the same environment that I would need to study for a final exam is kind of like the environment I like for personal reading. Now, when I'm reading for others, I'm a lot more strict on myself. I really need to be in the right mindset. Has to be quiet. There has to be specific, crystals around only because I like crystals and I like gemstones and I really work with those energies. But that's just me. So for other people, I'm a lot more strict to myself on what the setting has to be. And I talk about setting in the setting of a tarot reading in my book. For myself, just a quiet space and being there is enough.
Here's a rather specific question. Is it okay to not use reversals? Is it more limiting in some way?
No, it's not limiting at all. I really see tarot reversals as just an indication of what type of reader you are. So if you're somebody who's, I've said this before, if you're somebody who's very you're more into the imagination and more into the intuitive part of your mind. You're more right brain. You like to see the bigger picture, and you use spatial recognition and spatial awareness to ground and center you. Then reading with reversals is probably going to be counterintuitive and counterproductive. So when cards appear upside down, you're frustrated, you're distracted, you're already out of it. You're no longer in the zone. You can't do a good tarot reading because you've already been frustrated. So I would not recommend reading with reversals for right brain people or people who are more into spatial recognition, artistic people. A lot of artists actually are not that into reading with reversals. You see something upside down, your mind is all over the place. You can't do a tarot reading. So don't read with reversals if you're right brained. Now, if you're left brained, and you're a lot more analytical and you need as much information as possible, if you know that you can turn a card around and that there could be modifications of a meaning when a card is turned upside down and you don't turn a card upside down, that will drive you mad because you will constantly be asking yourself, what if, because you are just a hoarder of information. That's kind of how I am. I like to have as much information within the four corners of a tarot card as I can. So then people who are more analytical, who like to compartmentalize, who like to process information, then you're going to want to read with reversals and go through the trouble of learning the meanings upright and reverse so that you can feel comfortable and know that you're getting as much out of the cards as possible. And it's a purely subjective thing. It's not about an actual objective getting the most out of the cards. It's subjective. If you reading upright is enough for you to get the most, that is getting the most actually in your mind. For the person who is left-brained, because you know that a card in reverse can mean something different, if you don't read with reversals, that what if in your head is going to be distracting to you. So in that sense, you should read with reversals. That was my long-winded way of saying, read however you like.
Okay. Two real quick ones, and then we'll close. And this is a specific one that I think might apply to a lot of people. If I did a self reading about the days of the week and the cards say that Wednesday is a bad day for me, but I have a big meeting that day, is there a way to change that karma?
I don't see it as meaning that it's going to be a bad day. So for example, let's just say on Wednesday, you could be driving on a road and there's going to be a huge ditch in the ground, you know. So no one says you have to drive onto the ditch and have your tire pop. That's not really, in my worldview, that's not really an absolute. But perhaps the fact that you're going to be driving on a road with a ditch and then at some point face the decision of whether or not to, keep driving and pop your tire, or make, a second, an alternative arrangement so that you don't pop your tire. I believe that's the part that's, critical. So if, for example, you do a reading for yourself, and on Wednesday the card doesn't look so hot for Wednesday, I will look at the symbols, and in every single card the answers are there. Look for the symbols to see how you can avoid disasters, avoid negativity, and see the positivity in the cards, or the signs and symbols in that card that point you in a direction of avoidance. And when you read with that approach, when you see the cards with that perspective, then the card has multiple dimensions, and you're able to see how you can avoid the negative projections on the card within that single card.
Great. And the last question, are you available yourself for personal tarot consultation?
Yes, I do. I do tarot readings.
Great.
The information of it is on my website
And
under readings from Benebell.
and someone asked about the web address, and it's here on this slide, benebellwen.com. Thank you, everyone, so much, and especially you, Benebell, for coming this morning. I am
Thank you,
recording.
everyone.
I'm recording this presentation, and everyone will get a recording of both the audio and the video probably sometime tomorrow in your email inbox. So thanks very much, and have a lovely weekend.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.